Okay, well, for everyone who is joining us right now, welcome. This is the first time that the Preservation League has done a webinar. This isn't the first time that I've done a webinar. This is the first time that I'm hosting one though, so I hope that I'm coming through okay for everyone. And right now you should be able to see my screen. We have a PowerPoint presentation. This series is called Roadmap to Grant Funding, and this is a presentation that we developed a couple years ago, and we have several different types of roadmap presentations. We have a general one that's just called Roadmap to Preservation that talks in a little bit more broad terms about historic preservation in New York State. This one is all about our grant programs, and we usually try to do these presentations in the winter time to coincide with the opening of the Preserve New York program, which is the grant program that we have open right now. So if you are interested in applying for Preserve New York, which I know that some of you are, this should help you through the application process. And it's a good chance to maybe get some questions answered, think about some new things. And as I said a few minutes ago, this webinar is being recorded. We are going to put this on our website so that you can always review the session later, or if someone wasn't able to join, they can review later. And I'm also going to be emailing a PDF copy of all of these slides to everyone who's participating today. So you'll have all of this information that you see on the screen. And I usually say this in my in-person presentations too, no need to take furious notes because you'll have all of this information shortly afterwards. I'll send it later this afternoon. So, all right, I think we had a couple more people join us. And we will just go ahead and get started. So let me advance my slides. So before we begin, I would just like to say a big thank you to our two major funders. Our grant funding comes from the New York State Council on the Arts. It's a partnership grant program with NYSCA. Preserve New York has been a partnership since 1993, and the Technical Assistance Grant Program has been a partnership since 2012. We're extremely fortunate to have this support from NYSCA and to be able to work closely with our program directors at NYSCA, and this funding definitely makes an impact across New York State, so we're extremely grateful for that. We're also extremely grateful for the additional support from the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation. This is specific to our folks on Long Island. The Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation has provided generous additional support for our Preserve New York projects occurring in Nassau and Suffolk counties. So we are very grateful that these partnerships can exist, and this funding helps a lot of people. So I always like to start with a big thank you to our funders, because they do a lot for us and our program applicants. So let me tell you a little bit about the Preservation League. I think many of you are familiar with the Preservation League, but we are New York's statewide historic preservation nonprofit. In New York State, there are many different types of preservation nonprofits that focus more on local areas, but we are the organization that has a service area of all 62 counties. So we are located, our headquarters is in Albany, that's where we're located. This is our building, it's at 44 Central Avenue. If you look at the photograph, I'm actually sitting on the ground floor. So if you're ever in Albany and you're interested in stopping by, please come say hello. We think it's pretty awesome that we get to go to work every day in a historic building. Our building used to be a grain and feed store. So we are very invested in taking care of our building as well as helping you all take care of your buildings. So we're headquartered in Albany, but our coverage is statewide. We were founded in 1974. And we originally started as a grassroots effort, but years and years later, we are a fully professionally staffed organization. but we definitely started on the grassroots level. So now if you take a look at our website, we have an About Us section where you can see who's on staff here. This is our policy and technical services team. We have Erin Tobin, who's our Vice President for Policy and Preservation. We have Jana Rudler, who is our Southern Tier Field Services Consultant. She is based in Binghamton, and she helps a lot of our folks in the Southern Tier. And we have Christina Hingle, who is our Public Policy Associate. You might notice that my headshot is absent from this slide, and the reason for that is because this is actually my last week at the Preservation League. So it's been really great working with everyone for the past 5 years, but I am moving on. And so these are my colleagues who are going to be taking over the program after I go. They would be very happy to help all of you with your Preserve New York applications. But if you have any questions this week, I will certainly be here and I can answer them. So, what does the Preservation League do? We do a whole bunch of different things. So first of all, since we're the statewide preservation nonprofit, we collaborate with local preservation colleagues around the state. We like to bring together our colleagues to talk about what's going on in preservation in different parts of the state, to talk about issues, to see how we can provide support and technical assistance to our colleagues. It's important that we all stay in the loop with each other. What's going on in Buffalo might be very different than what's happening in New York City, and it's our job to kind of keep in touch with all of that. We provide technical services and educational outreach, so this workshop is part of our outreach and education program. We also do other types of workshops as well. We make excellence awards every year because it is extremely important that we celebrate good preservation work in New York State. So each winter, usually, I think we're changing the timeline a little bit this year, but at some point during the year, we will open nominations for awards, and anyone who's been involved with a good preservation project is welcome to submit different awards nominations. And these are all honored at a ceremony in New York City every year. We also make grants and loans. We have the Preserve New York program, the TAG program. Those two I'm going to talk about in detail today. And we also have a program called EPIP, or Endangered Properties Intervention Fund program. And these are revolving loans that we make to preservation projects in need of some immediate assistance. We also conduct public policy research and initiatives. We have a dedicated public policy team that is regularly meeting with legislators. It's very helpful that our headquarters is right down the street from the Capitol. We want to make sure that our senators and assembly members know that preservation is important and that it needs to stay at the forefront of the conversation. We were very successful in lobbying to keep the historic tax credits in place in 2017 when tax reform was happening. And so we are always just making sure that we are staying in touch with our legislators. We are having Advocacy Day later in February, and there will be some information up on our website if anyone is interested in coming and lobbying with us. We also do a lot of advocacy. We have an advocacy program called 7 to Save, which is where every 2 years we nominate, we invite the public to nominate endangered sites to our 7 to Save list. They're chosen by a committee made up of some of our trustees. And for the 2 years and beyond that something is designated as a 7 to Save, we provide some increased technical assistance to that site to advance their preservation cause. So we are going to get ready to announce our 2020 and 2021 7 to Save list very soon. The 7 have been chosen. And we will be issuing a press release, I think, at some point later this week about the 7 that are going to be this next list. So when we start talking about grants, we should talk a little bit about capital project planning. This is something that I like to discuss before we discuss the grants, because as you'll see, The grants that we have available from the Preservation League are all for preservation planning studies. So they're things that you might do at the beginning of a very large preservation project. So before you make a plan, it's good to plan your plan, if you will. So internally, what you should always do first is you should decide how this preservation project fits your organization or your institution's mission. Is it very important to the functioning of your municipality to restore your town hall? Are you an arts organization that is devoted to saving a historic theater? Are you a community group that is invested in making a preservation plan for your neighborhood? So you need to decide how the project that you're going to embark on fits into your organization and your institution's mission. The next thing that you should do before you're going to apply for any kind of grant is you should always review your finances and think about whether or not this is the best time to take on a fundraising campaign. And you should always prepare for fundraising because grants alone are never going to cover the total project cost. Every grantor has different match requirements. Some are more strict than others. Grantors are always going to want to see that their investment in your project is being met with an investment by you in your project as well. The other thing that you should always do when you're doing a preservation project is you should hire qualified professionals, whether they're building or preservation professionals. And the reason for this is that we say you get what you pay for. So while your nonprofit organization might have very talented people who serve on your board, you might not want to have your board members do your building condition report. You might want to have certain board committees, people with architectural expertise sit on your planning committee or your building committee, but you should definitely always think about hiring qualified building professionals. So the next steps can really vary depending on your building's needs. This is a very broad, simplified overview of how this goes, and so just use it as a general outline. It's not something that is always going to come out perfectly, so I just always say that. When you're doing a big building preservation project, you might want to start with a condition assessment, because if your building needs a lot of work, it is helpful to understand exactly what the condition is so that you can figure out how to fix it. After a condition assessment, depending on what your final goal is, you might decide to go a little bit deeper and complete something like a historic structure report or a cultural landscape report. These are more in-depth types of planning projects that are very useful for sites that are interpreted. We'll talk a little bit more about what those types of projects are later. After you do all of that planning work is when you can prioritize your capital project and work on plans and specifications, bid for contractors, and then actually go ahead and start the project. I have a question. May we have, and would you forward a copy of this PowerPoint for future reference? Yes, absolutely. So everyone who is registered is going to get a PDF copy of this PowerPoint, so no worries about that. Let's see. So feasibility studies are also something that we'll talk about. That goes into those beginning categories. So we'll do some. We'll get some more detail on HSRs, CLRs, and feasibility studies a little bit later. But so those are general steps for planning a big preservation project. So let's continue. So we have two grant programs that I'm going to talk about in detail. They are both partnerships with the New York State Council on the Arts. We will talk a little bit about the Technical Assistance Grant, or the TAG program, and then we will talk a little bit about the Preserve New York grant program. So I'm just going to have some water. All right. So the first program that I'll start with is the Technical Assistance Grant Program. This is our smaller grant program. We have had this since 2012. Again, it's funded by NYSCA, and in 2019 we had support from the Hudson River Valley Greenway, the Hudson River Valley National Heritage Area, We have also had partnerships in the past with the Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor. The program is for nonprofits and municipalities, 501c3 nonprofits and municipalities. That's very important, and it's definitely a question that you will be asked if you're interested in applying for the program. There are lots of different 501c tax filing statuses for different cultural groups and nonprofits, but NISCA can only fund 501c3 nonprofits. The TAG program is also most intended for structures that serve an arts or cultural purpose. So this program is meant for municipalities that own spaces that are used for arts and cultural programming, or nonprofit arts organizations, spaces that are publicly used and open to the public. That will definitely be a question on the grant application. One thing to keep in mind is that all of our grant programs through NISCA cannot fund religious institutions or New York State-owned sites. And the reason for that is because there are other funds available for those types of applicants. The applicants to the TAG program either have to own the building outright or have a long-term lease on the space. But even still, if the building is owned by a private owner but leased to a nonprofit, it doesn't qualify. It still has to be physically owned by a 501c3 nonprofit or a municipality. Sometimes we can help applicants work out what we call fiscal sponsorship situations. We do have many municipalities in New York State that are the owners of buildings, but they have leases or stewardship agreements with nonprofits. For example, a county might own a museum, but the museum is stewarded. The museum is a 501c3, but they lease the building from the county. That would qualify for our programs. So the TAG program can fund up to $4,000, and there's a required 20% cash match for a total project not over $5,000. So since the TAG projects can't exceed $5,000, they're meant to be much smaller, sort of discrete types of preservation projects that focus on a very specific issue that will help you get to the bottom of that issue and get started on a bigger preservation project right away. So they're supposed to be quick preservation planning studies. So in 2018, this is an example photo that we have here. We funded a project at the town of Angelica. We funded a specialized conservation study. They own this beautiful building that was originally a church, then it was sold to the local Grange, and now it's used as an arts and cultural space in the municipality. And they were having some noise reverberation issues, which was making it very difficult for them to use the space for arts and cultural programs because they were having so many acoustical issues. So they hired an architectural firm through our technical assistance grant program to do a study on the building about how they could better the acoustics for different uses without destroying the historic integrity on the interior. And so hopefully they'll be able to implement those changes and then use this awesome space more often. So the TAG program can fund different things like building condition surveys. We say specific building condition surveys because if you think about a $5,000 project cap, $5,000 probably isn't going to be able to fund a comprehensive building condition analysis of a building unless it's very small. So a specific condition survey, this might be really great for a roof assessment or a window conservation assessment or a moisture study, a foundation assessment. So Preservation League staff can help you determine the best type of TAG project to apply for if you're having trouble. If you have a lot of things to think about and you need some assistance. TAG can also fund an engineering and structural analysis. So we have had applicants come to us before and say that they're having structural concerns about their buildings. So an engineering project is a great one for TAG. Feasibility or reuse studies. This is something I mentioned a little bit earlier. If you're taking a historic building and you intend to use it in a new way for what it was, a different way than it was originally intended for, then you might need to do some specific study to figure out how to best rehabilitate it. So a feasibility study would be an in-depth planning project that talks about different and good ways to reuse an old space or rehabilitate a space while preserving its historic integrity. Feasibility studies can also have to do with your individual programming. So they can be very helpful if you're taking a vacant building and putting it back online. And we have had groups apply for TAG before that are interested in looking at different feasibility or reuse plans for different spaces in their buildings. We also fund handicapped accessibility studies through this program. The TAG program, since it focuses on structures that are serving arts and cultural purposes and that are open to the public, accessibility is extremely important. Everyone should be able to access historic buildings, but usually there's a better way to go about it than just putting an elevator shaft right on the outside of the building in the front, or a ramp in a place that is going to compromise the historic integrity of the building. So a handicapped accessibility study would provide you the opportunity to work with an architect who's well-versed in codes and ADA compliance, but also design and create a creative way to create that accessibility without actually compromising the integrity of the building. TAG also funds mechanical, electrical, and plumbing analysis studies. This can also include fire suppression and HVAC, which again are all things that are extremely important for spaces that are open to the public. Older buildings have older systems. There's no better way to say it. And it's not necessary that you keep using that original boiler system from the early 20th century if it's not working for you. We have had applicants seek funding from TAG before without, they don't have air conditioning in their theater, and they are unable to have performances in the summer because it gets too hot. So those mechanical studies can really help with that. And we also can fund, we have this last category that we call the specialized conservation category. And there are some projects that don't quite fit into these other boxes of the technical assistance grant program. So for example, we have funded a couple different paint analysis projects because we have museums or cultural sites that are interested in studying the paint on the exterior or the interior of their buildings. We also recently, this past round, funded a specialized conservation study that has to do with uncovering historic wallpaper on the inside of a meeting house. So that specialized conservation category is there if your project doesn't really fit into one of these other categories. Let's see. We also have another question. Is it okay to apply to the program if the building is owned by a private organization but leased long-term to an arts nonprofit? It would depend on what the private organization is, what their tax filing status is. If they're a 501c3, then they could definitely, then that might work, but that might be something that we would have to talk about for your specific project. I just need some more detail on that. So, all right, let's continue. So the next program that we'll talk a little bit about is Preserve New York. This is the program that we have applications available for right now. As I mentioned earlier, Preserve New York has been a NISCA partnership of ours since 1993. Preserve New York, again, is also open to nonprofits and municipalities, but not religious institutions or New York State-owned sites. So that's just a general rule of thumb, something to keep in mind. The same ownership and leasing qualifications apply for Preserve New York as for TAG. The applicant either must own the building outright or have a long-term lease. The exception to this rule is if you're applying in the cultural resource survey category, where you're going to be looking at a series of buildings, whether they're commercial structures in town or residential structures. You don't have to own the structures that you're surveying, but you do have to be a 501c3 nonprofit or municipality if you're going to be sponsoring that survey through the grant program. So for site-specific projects, though, the ownership situation of the building is very important. Preserve New York is a little bit different than TAG because it funds 4 very specific types of projects. We'll talk in detail about each one of those project types. The grant awards for Preserve New York are larger. They typically range between $3,000 and $10,000. We have made larger grants before, and we also have made smaller grants before, depending on what an applicant is asking for. Preserve New York, there's no cap in the project budget, so the total project budget might be $20,000, $50,000. It might only be $10,000. So the way that I like to explain it to folks is that Preserve New York can be either a large component of a smaller project or a small component of a larger project. There is a required 20% cash match. So if you are applying for a project where your total project cost is going to be $10,000, you would be asking for $8,000 from the grant program, and you would be required to contribute $2,000 for 20% of that total project. So again, Preservation League staff can help you figure out what amount is most appropriate to request from the grant program if you're having trouble. So the 4 different types of projects, they are very specific. There used to be only 3 of them, but in 2016 we added the building condition report category, and we found that there was a great need for this category. So we were happy that we were able to add that. So we'll talk about these individually, and I'll give some examples just so you can see. Let's see, we have, nope, I'm moving myself around the screen so that I'm not gonna block anybody's view of the PowerPoint while we're talking about this. So a building condition report is exactly what it sounds like. It's a comprehensive condition analysis of a structure. This can be tailored to meet your individual building's needs. And usually these types of projects are completed by architects, but they might consult with engineers depending on what you're after. The Preserve New York Building Condition Report category is meant to be different than the Technical Assistance Grant Building Conditions Survey category. The TAG Building Conditions Survey category is very useful if you want to get really into a specific feature of your building. And again, it's because of that $5,000 project cap. So if you wanted to do an in-depth study of your roof, TAG would be a great fit for that. Preserve New York gives you a chance to do a comprehensive condition analysis of the building. So this is a chance to look at the interior, the exterior, both of them together, the architectural features, the structure, and the structural capacity of the building, if that is useful to you. This is something that is great to do if you're at the beginning of a big preservation project, but maybe you have been a nonprofit operating in a historic building for a very long time, and the last condition report you had done was in the 1970s. Or even in the early 2000s, you might want to update that building condition report. And the reason for this is because if you're going to be doing any rehabilitation or restoration work, it's useful to have the condition report as a roadmap or a planning document, but this can also be a really useful document if you're just thinking about everyday maintenance, or you want to start creating a maintenance log, or just keep track of things that you're doing in the building. It'll outline a list of priorities and things that you should pay attention to or take care of, because maybe your roof is in great shape right now, but a few years from now, you're going to have to think about some repairs on the roof. The very important thing to note about these types of projects that we're talking about today, this applies for both Preserve New York and TAG, is that these types of planning projects, the consultant scopes of work should not include line items for schematic design. no schematic design, no construction documents. And this is something that we wanted to add specifically into our outreach because we learn new things about the grant program every year. And even though sometimes we print in the guidelines have always said that no schematic designs can be funded. We just wanted to make sure that as part of our outreach, we are educating our applicants about what is eligible and what is not. So again, no schematic design. The Preserve New York Building Condition Report category, and I understand this is a little confusing, should also not include feasibility study work in the Building Condition Report category. The Building Condition Report category is specifically for architectural condition assessment. If you are interested in doing a feasibility study, the most appropriate program to apply for is through TAG to do a specific feasibility study. And I think we had another question. Can TAG fund construction plans and specifications? That's an excellent question, and no, it cannot. Neither one of our programs can fund construction documents. They are supposed to be for the planning and study assessment work that actually comes before doing schematic designs or construction documents. So we have an example of a building condition report. This was a project that we funded in 2018. This is an arts organization called the Visual Studies Workshop in Rochester. They have this amazing building. And they sought a limited amount of funding. They just needed to update a couple things on an older building condition report. So they were awarded a $2,400 grant for a local architecture firm to update an existing condition report that they had. Because they were very interested in making sure that they were preserving their windows, that there wasn't any major leaks anywhere that they needed to be aware of. So that was an awesome project. So now we'll talk a little bit about historic structure reports. These are slightly different from building condition reports. They're a little bit more extensive. So a historic structure report is similar to a building condition report in that it includes that comprehensive condition analysis, but a historic structure report goes a little bit deeper because it also includes research and documentation about the building's architectural and social history. So this is extremely useful for sites that are open to the public and interpreted. So we have had museums that have done historic structure reports, historic sites, historical societies that operate buildings that were previously owned by a prominent family in town or something similar to that. Historic structure reports are again usually completed by architects or building professionals that have architectural history experience. So you might actually need a couple different consultants to work on a historic structure report depending on how extensively you're doing that, because you might have a person in an architectural firm who is responsible for the condition analysis part, and then you have a historian who's responsible for that architectural history part. But you might also just have one person who can do the whole thing. So again, a historic structure report shouldn't include feasibility study or schematic design work. It should be a specific proposal that will include that condition analysis work as well as that research and documentation. If you're confused about whether or not you should apply for a building condition report or a historic structure report project, that's something that league staff can help you with. We often talk with our applicants about what their final goal is. And an HSR is definitely not necessary for everyone. But a building condition report might be a better fit. So that is something that we can definitely help you with. The other thing that I like to note about HSR projects is because they have a couple different components, they have that condition analysis work as well as that architectural history work, they are going to understandably be much more expensive, especially if it's a comprehensive historic structure report and that resource has never had anything like that done before. So that's just something to keep in mind. Definitely more on the expensive side. So this is a recent example of an HSR project that we funded this past round through Preserve New York 2019. This is a building called the General Walter Martin House that's owned by the Lewis County Historical Society. This was a house that belonged to a wealthy financier in the area. The town of Martinsburg is named for General Walter Martin. This building is pretty interesting because it was constructed in 1805, but it had some major additions made in 1834, so it definitely evolved over time as the family, you know, 2 generations of the family continued to live in it. And it was given to the Lewis County Historical Society. They are in the process of rehabbing it so that it can be continuously open to the public, and so they wanted to have some understanding about its condition but also its history. So they received a $10,000 grant from Preserve New York to complete an HSR that will help them create a maintenance plan, think about issues in the building, but also create an interpretive plan. So the next type of project that we have to discuss is called a cultural landscape report. And a cultural landscape report is very similar to a historic structure report, but instead of looking at a building, a cultural landscape report will look at a landscape. So we have many amazing landscapes in New York State. Some of them are designed, some of them are totally wild and natural. Some of them, we have historic sites that have landscapes as well as buildings. We have places like Adirondack Park or town forests. So those are all different types of landscapes. So a cultural landscape report looks at the same kinds of things that an HSR project would, but it's focused on the natural land as opposed to the man-made building. So again, it will include condition analysis and description of historic significance, and it also might look at a period of significance or talk about treatment plans or recommendations, because maybe it's a historic cemetery that has space open to the public, but they'd like some understanding of how to treat the landscape or to keep it in that period of significance. So these types of projects are usually completed by landscape architects, someone who is well-versed in the development and the history of landscapes, but also can look at current plantings and think about condition. This is our least popular project category by far out of all of the Preserve New York projects. So we are definitely always encouraging cultural landscape reports because they're very important, and we've funded lots of exciting cultural landscape reports over the years. But a recent example that we have is the Seward House Museum. This is a historic site that is in Auburn, New York. In 2015, they received funds for a cultural landscape report. The historic site is actually this building, the Seward House. It was the home of William Henry Seward, who was Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. His home is open to the public as a museum. They have art, furniture, different exhibits, but along with the house, they have this awesome garden in the back. And so back in 2015, one of the first Preserve New York grants that they applied for from us was they received funds for this landscape report because they wanted to study the development of the garden. There were some pathways and driveways that had been overgrown over time, so they wanted to kind of uncover more detail about what that garden would have actually looked like when Seward lived there, so that they could add some garden programming into their roster of interpretive programs. So they received $10,000 in 2015 for the creation of that cultural landscape report. The last type of project that Preserve New York can fund is really in its own category, because this is the one that looks specifically at a group of resources as opposed to one particular building or resource. So a cultural resource survey is in its simplest form, it's an inventory of historic resources in a municipality or a neighborhood. And It's a chance to look at a group of resources and think about significance, architectural style, patterns of development, and it sort of lays the groundwork for preservation planning, whether or not it's at the local or the state or the federal level. So when we talk about cultural resource surveys in communities, we talk about them at a couple different levels. So for many, the goal of a cultural resource survey might be to, it might simply be to get an understanding of what kinds of resources make up your community, but the final goal might also be to pursue a state and national register nomination. So having some understanding of what resources are in your community so that you can actually create a district. There are different types of districts. We have them at the state and national level. So the National Register of Historic Places is a term that you might hear quite a lot. And we also have communities in New York State that choose to locally regulate their historic districts. And that one's kind of in its own category because the final goal and the process is a little bit different than pursuing a state and national register nomination. So if you're approaching the league and you're interested in applying for a cultural resource survey project, the first question that we're going to ask you is if any inventory or survey work has been completed before. So usually the first step is to start out with a reconnaissance or an intensive level survey. So you see those first two levels here on the screen. A reconnaissance level survey is a survey in the most broad sense. So it's basically taking that broad brush inventory of the resources in your community, thinking roughly about when those resources were created, how many of them there are, what architectural styles or types they fall into, sort of laying the groundwork for any potential districts by just getting a sense of what's there. An intensive level will look a little bit more deeply at the history of those resources, the history of that community. And then obviously the last level, a state and national register nomination, will include a lot of history and documentation about the development of that community and those resources, and also the degree of whether or not they still possess architectural integrity, because in order to be added to the state and national registers of historic places, those historic resources still have to possess a pretty high degree of historic integrity. Local district designation, as I mentioned, it's a little bit different. That's when you hear about a community that will have either a historic review board, an architectural review board. So some communities choose to locally regulate the character of architectural resources. They will have local historic districts that have rules and regulations about what you can and can't do with your property, where you'll have to appear before that architectural review board if you're doing a project. National register nomination is a little bit different because it doesn't have any of those restrictions. So again, depending on what your final goal is in your community and how you would ultimately like your preservation plan to play out, Preservation League staff can help you determine what type of survey project to apply for. So I am going to briefly spotlight a cultural resource survey project. This is the Jamestown Renaissance Corporation. This is an organization based in Jamestown in Chautauqua County. They have done a great number of Preserve New York projects over the years. But in 2015, they first received funding for a National Register nomination of the Lakeview Avenue Historic District. In 2018, they applied for funds for an intensive level survey of a different neighborhood called Forest Heights. And then in 2019, they received some additional funding to actually nominate that neighborhood to the National Register of Historic Places. So that's something that they're actively working on right now. So the state and national registers of historic places, I talked a little bit about those before, but essentially here is what they mean. So when something is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, that designation means that that resource has historic, cultural, or architectural significance at either the local, state, or national level. It basically means that that resource is historically significant. The whole process of being listed on the National Register of Historic Places is coordinated with state and federal government. So if you are interested in pursuing a National Register nomination, you will often hear league staff talk about coordinating with SHPO. It's very important to talk to the State Historic Preservation Office and work with them on this process. There also is such a thing as an individual building listing on the National Register as well as a district. When we are funding cultural resource survey projects in that Preserve New York category, we are mostly looking at district listings. We don't typically fund individual National Register listings. We're looking at having districts placed on the National Register. But the important distinction between the National Register and local historic preservation regulation is that they're not equal in terms of regulation. So you might often hear your friends and neighbors talk about, oh, I don't want to be listed on the National Register because then I won't be able to paint my house whatever color I want, or I won't be able to change the windows. That's definitely not true with the National Register. That might be true. It's probably true with a local historic district. That those are the districts that have very strict rules where you as a property owner are expected to maintain your property according to historic standards set out in your local ordinance. But the National Register doesn't work like that. There are certain sorry, I just got a little distracted. I wanted to go back a slide. There are certain ways that the National Register can be useful as a means of protection. So it is connected to federal historic preservation law. So it will potentially trigger a review project if there is a project happening nearby with state or federal funds or permits that is going to impact historic resources. So the example that I like to give is if the Federal Highway Administration comes through a small community and they say, we're going to build a highway here and we're going to use federal funds to do that. If there's a National Register Historic District in the path of that potential project, they will have to go through a federal review process called Section 106, which is where they consider the impacts to those historic resources. And at the local level, the state review is called 1409. This also can be useful in the seeker process, if you've heard about this. So the National Register can act as a measure of protection, but it's not restrictive in most scenarios. So that's just the major thing to remember. When you are listed on the National Register, whether it's a district or an individual building, it's because of one or more of several reasons. And the 4 criteria for being listed on the National Register are here on this slide. So the first one is that those resources are associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. The second is that it's associated with a significant person or event. So the example that you always hear preservationists say is George Washington slept here. That's just like that's something that we say sometimes. The third category is that it embodies distinctive characteristics of a type, a method of construction. It has high artistic value. So I like to boil that down in my brain as thinking about significant architecture, significant works of architecture that are related to architectural types or styles. And the fourth category is that it yields information that's important to history, prehistory or history. So that's an archaeological category because there are archaeological resources that can be listed on the state and national registers. So what this designation means for property owners, and this this map that you see here on the slide, this is Jamestown. So when I was talking about the Jamestown Renaissance Corporation earlier and the projects that they have applied for funding before, the Lakeview Avenue Historic District is the large, long one at the top. They have a downtown historic district that's right in the middle of the screen, and then at the bottom of the screen is the Forest Heights project that they're working on. So the brown outline was the initial intensive level survey project, and that survey yielded information about a potential historic district, which is the smaller purple outline in the middle. So historic designation means different things for property owners. It can open up opportunities for tax credits. There are federal rehabilitation tax credits for commercial properties. So when we say commercial, we mean income producing properties. New York State also has a rehabilitation tax credit program for commercial properties. And New York State also has a historic homeowner tax credit program for owner-occupied buildings. So if you live in a home that is in a historic district and you would like to do some work on your property, you can actually get funds back for the work that you do on your property if you follow the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation and you work with the State Historic Preservation Office. And if anyone is interested in more information about tax credits specifically, just let me know and I would be happy to get it to you. National Register designation can also be extremely useful for nonprofits and municipalities because many times it will open up grant opportunities. So there are grants where the first qualification for eligibility is that the building has to be listed on the National Register. The Preservation League grant programs that we're talking about today do not have that qualification. We are open to resources that are not listed on the National Register. And in fact, with our grant programs, we help places get listed on the National Register. So that's just something to keep in mind. So now you might want to know, how do I apply for these programs that we have been talking about? So the process is pretty simple. We try to make it as user-friendly as possible. And this year we're changing things up a little bit. We now have something new on our website. We have a part 1 and a part 2 of the application. The first step is to visit our website and fill out the part 1. This is the eligibility pre-check. So whereas we used to say that you needed to call the Preservation League to get an application, we now have this process where you can go online anytime, fill out part 1, and then League staff will contact you to talk to you about your project and provide you part 2. So it is a way to streamline things a little bit because we wanted everyone to be able to feel like they could ask questions about the program without picking up the phone, because sometimes it's not always convenient to do that. The next step when you're getting ready to actually get started on the part 2 of the application is to contact your consultant of choice for that planning project and explain what you're doing. You are going to need to submit a project proposal and a scope of work for the project that you're doing. So the consultant will actually need to give you a project proposal for you to submit with the grant application. The next thing that you'll need to do is go over the application checklist very carefully. We have instructions this year that you'll receive when you receive part 2. So as well as the guidelines on the website and this webinar, we also have instructions that go with filling out the application. You should never be afraid to ask questions because that's important. That's how you learn things. That's how League staff learns more about your project. And it's important for us too because we need to know if there's anything that we can be doing better or explaining better. The other thing that you always want to make sure that you're doing is you're submitting your grant application and the required supplemental materials on time, and also that you're following the instructions. So I will tell you a little bit about how these grants are evaluated. Each year for both Preserve New York and TAG, when it comes time to actually make the decisions, we compile an independent grant review panel of expert preservationists from around New York State. So the people who actually make the decisions are not League staff. League staff will review all of the grant applications first, and they will reach out to you if you have questions. Sometimes we do site visits. That's usually a good chance to learn about the site and the project. And these evaluation criteria that you see here on the screen are also printed in the guidelines to the grant program, which are up on our website. There are 3 evaluation criteria that the grant panel is going to look at. The first one is historic preservation excellence and project quality. So again, when we talked in the very beginning of this webinar about thinking about how your project fits into your organization's mission, that's good information to put in a question about this category. So thinking about what makes your preservation project excellent. And this also looks at the consultant and their materials, whether or not they're the right fit for the project. The second category is fiscal and managerial competence. This has to do with your organizational budgets, how organized your organization is, whether or not this is the best time for you to be doing this grant project, whether or not it makes sense, whether or not your application was filled out correctly. That will also be looked at in this category. And the third category is service to the public. So with a lot of those tag projects that we have, those resources are open to the public, either for arts and cultural events, or maybe it's a museum, maybe it's a historical society, a theater. So service to the public is something that you're going to want to explain. If the resource isn't open to the public yet, then it is important to think long-term about how achieving that preservation or rehabilitation project is ultimately going to serve the public. And this is true with cultural resource survey projects as well. How is creating a preservation plan in your community going to benefit people in your community? These are exactly the same grant evaluation criteria that are utilized by the New York State Council on the Arts. So we decided, since they are our funders, we wanted to follow their evaluation criteria very closely. One of the materials that the grant application is going to include is a summary letter. You're going to have to write a summary letter about your project. And I often direct people to these 3 criteria in the guidelines, because if you are having trouble thinking about how to discuss your project, how to summarize your project, you can actually discuss all of these things in the summary letter. That's usually very useful, and sometimes it's a good place to start if you're kind of having a little bit of brain fog about how to summarize your project and what you're doing. So this section is a little bit about grant tips and tricks. It's specific to our application process, but I want you to know that these are tips and tricks that you can use if you're applying for any type of grant. So they're just helpful things to keep in mind. And these have been compiled over the years based on feedback from grant applicants, experiences that we've had running this grant program. So we decided to include these things here. So the first tip is to read all the directions and the forms that come with the grant application. So when you apply for a Preservation League grant, you're going to have 3 different things available to you. Number 1 is the actual grant application. So for us, for Preserve New York, it's part 1 and part 2. The part 2 piece that you'll actually go to submit on the grant deadline is a fillable PDF form. That's also how the tag applications are structured. It's a PDF that you can edit right on your computer. There are also guidelines to the grant program. These are up on our website right now, so anyone can download those at any time. And what's new this year is we've actually created grant application instructions to go with the part 2 form that you'll fill out. So we went through question by question and we explained exactly what that question is asking for. So that is sometimes useful too if you can't get to league staff or can't get your question answered right away. It's always a good idea to still ask questions of your funders if you are still having trouble. So we encourage you to ask questions, but we wanted to make sure that we were doing our best to get your questions answered first before you have a chance to ask them. So, but it doesn't mean you can't ask questions by any means. The second thing that you should always do is pay attention to your budgets. So we require 2 different types of budgets from every applicant. And you should look very closely at any grant application that you're working on and see what they require in terms of a budget, because they might all be a little bit different. So, but for Preservation League grants, we require 2 different types of budgets. We are looking for an organizational budget. So that's a snapshot of your organization's finances. And this budget document has to demonstrate both income and expenses. I have seen budgets before where people are only telling me how much they're spending. That is not helpful if we can't see how much funding you're taking in every year. So this budget, this organizational budget document has to demonstrate income and expenses. If you're a municipal applicant, we do not need to see an exhaustive municipal budget that's hundreds and hundreds of pages that has every department on it. Don't worry about sending that to us. You can submit a one-page summary of the income and expenses for the specific department that's in charge of this grant project. But again, let us know if you have any questions about that. The second type of budget that we are going to require is a project budget. That is the budget that it's going to take to have the consultant actually go ahead and complete that project. It has to show a clear breakdown of project tasks, deliverables, and totals. So the project budget, when we talk about this, that refers to the amount of money that the consultant is going to be compensated in order to complete that report or that survey project. So we get a lot of questions about this from time to time, but project budget in our case does not refer to any capital expenses for restoration or rehabilitation that will follow a report. Because as you're familiar with, after having watched this webinar, the Preservation League only funds planning and study projects. We don't fund any kind of bricks and mortar work or restoration. So we are not interested in however much money it's going to take to actually restore your building. Because completing a building condition report or an HSR or even a landscape report, that ultimately will outline cost estimates that will tell you how much that rehabilitation project is going to cost. So we're only interested in the amount of funding that it's going to take for your consultant to complete that planning project. So that's what project budget means. So again, just as a reminder, you need to submit 2 budgets to the Preservation League when you're applying for our grant programs, that organizational budget and the project budget. Tip number 3 is that images are everything. If you are submitting a grant application that has to do with a historic building or site, you need to think about it from the eyes of the grant reviewers. And most likely, those people sitting around the table are never going to have visited your site before. So you need to think about using images as a way to tell a story. Preserve New York and TAG have different requirements for images. For Preserve New York, we're looking for 10 images, no more, no less. If it's a site-specific project, like a condition report or a historic structure report, we're looking for an overall photograph of the building. But for, as well as specific images of that building, but we'd like to see one overall shot so we can get a sense of what it looks like. For a cultural resource survey project, you can submit images of individual buildings, but we'd also like to see a representative streetscape. So just a general street view of what the resources in that community look like. For the technical assistance grants, we require less images, 5 images, no more, no less. All TAG projects have to do with one specific building or site. So it's important to submit an overall photograph as well as specific photographs of issues that you'd like to explain to the grant panel. So think of it as a chance to illustrate what you're talking about in your grant application. So the hint here is to consider that the grant review panel has most likely never seen or visited your site before. So think about what kind of story you're telling. This is an example that I like to give when I talk about images. It always makes me smile. These are 2 images that I've received from actual grant applicants before. The image on the left is a site in the Hudson Valley. They were applying for condition report funding of this barn, so that they could think about how to better use it at their site. The image on the right is something that I received from a technical assistance grant a couple years ago. It's kind of hard to tell what it is, but it's a close-up shot of an electrical socket in a carpet. And this was the only image that was submitted with the grant application. So the grant review panel really didn't have any idea of what they were looking at. It didn't really communicate what the actual grant application was trying to explain, and it turned out that the overall building was a lovely historic library that really just needed a mechanical and electrical assessment. But it would have been better if we had had a representative image of what the building was, and then some other images of illustrating some of those mechanical concerns a little bit better. So again, just something to think about, and people usually like this example because it usually drives home my point about how images are really important. The fourth tip, and this is something that I've already mentioned a bunch of times before, is that if you have a question, you should definitely ask. So if there's something that we aren't explaining well in our materials, that is okay. And you should definitely always be encouraged to reach out and ask questions. So there are a couple different ways that you can do that. Extension 12 at our office is Erin. Extension 13 is our office manager, who can also answer questions. And we have a handy dandy email address just for grants. It's grants@preservenys.org. That is also how you will go and submit your application. So never be afraid to ask questions. If you'd like to schedule a phone call or have a conversation about your project, that is always welcomed as well. And the last tip is to check your checklists. So grant applications will usually come with a checklist of required supplemental materials. They will lose points if it's missing some of its supplemental materials because they're used to evaluate the grant application. So the reason for this tip is that an incomplete application is actually very difficult to review. If you forget to submit a budget, it's hard for us to see what kind of fundraising you're doing or what your plans are. And if you forget to submit something like a consultant proposal, then the grant panel is going to have a really hard time evaluating what you're actually going to be doing. So it's really, really important that you check over your checklists, because also when it comes time to submit, Preservation League staff actually cannot tell you if you are missing something after the fact. So it's very, very important that you go through and make sure that you're attaching all your files. If you want to send multiple emails, that's fine, but just make sure that you are submitting everything. So there's a couple other funding sources in New York State that we can talk a little bit about. We have done specific grant presentations before about some of these other funding sources in detail. Sacred Sites of the New York Landmarks Conservancy is extremely important. That's a funding source for churches and other sacred places. So religious organizations that are listed on the National Register and are actively used for worship. They can provide funds for exterior restoration and rehabilitation projects. The State Historic Preservation Office also has grants available through the Environmental Protection Fund. Those applications go through the consolidated funding application. They're usually open in the summertime. There might be a local foundation or an organization in your backyard that has funding available specifically for a preservation project. So it's always important to look directly around you in your vicinity and see what is available. The New York State Council on the Arts, our funder for this program, also has their own grant programs available. And I'll give you a little bit more information about those in just a second. The National Trust for Historic Preservation has funding sources available for their organizational forum members. So if you're interested in those, it might be really worth it for your organization to join their forum. And there's also very large federal funds available from programs like Save America's Treasures, which we just had the deadline for in December. So look for that funding again in the future. So I wanted to talk a little bit about NYSCA because our funding for Preserve New York comes from the Architecture and Design program, and the funding specifically for building condition reports in Preserve New York, as well as the Technical Assistance Grant program, comes from the Facilities program. And those are just 2 of the 15 programs that NYSCA has. So they have a ton of different types of funding sources that can also be really useful for preservation organizations that run arts and cultural sites. So they have grants available this year that are going to be due on March 12th. So if you're interested in this, you should head to arts.ny.gov for more information very soon, because the applications are available now. They also have full guidelines on their website and pre-qualification instructions, because their process, I believe, goes through Grants Gateway as well. They also do webinars and have technical assistance. And again, March 12th is the deadline. So it's good to consider NISCA as a funding source as well. So the deadline for Preserve New York 2020 this year is going to be April 6th, so there is still plenty of time to apply. If you're interested, we are asking everyone to go to our website at preservenys.org, which is right here, and fill out part 1. You'll see a little banner at the top that talks a little bit about Preserve New York. You can head directly to the grants page and fill out the part 1 of the application. There also are a couple different ways to follow us online. We have a Facebook and an Instagram. If you have a question, you can email our main info line. If you have a grants question, you can email the grants page. But definitely check out our website. We have an awesome blog too, where we talk about what we're up to. So that's a good way to learn more information. So I am going to stop sharing my screen right now. I am very happy that all of you came to participate in this webinar today. If you have any questions, then definitely feel free to ask them. I think I answered some of the questions that we talked about earlier. So the first question was, will I forward a PowerPoint? Yes, definitely. I will forward a PowerPoint. The PowerPoint that we just looked at, so that you can see the slides and have them to review later on. The second question was about construction plans and specifications, and no, unfortunately we can't fund those. And then we also had a question that was about building ownership situations and building owned by a private organization but leased long-term to an arts nonprofit. The owner of the building still has to be a 501c3 or a municipality. So again, if you have a question about that, that's something that league staff can help you with. So if there are any other questions, definitely let me know. But if there are no more questions, then that is just fine. This webinar is also being recorded, and we will put it up on our website at some point so that it will be available in the future for you to review. And yeah, so I would just like to thank you all for coming. Again, thank you to NISCA and the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation for the funding that we have through our Preserve New York and our technical assistance grant programs. It is good to keep in mind that the application deadline for PNY is on April 6th, so there's still plenty of time to apply. Feel free to give us a call if you have questions, or email anytime. And I hope that the audio has been okay. This is the first time that we've ever done a webinar before, so if you have any feedback or ways that we can improve, we definitely would welcome that. All right, so I think that's going to be it for today. So thank you all for coming. Enjoy the rest of your day, your week. Good luck on your preservation projects, and thank you very much for joining me.